All right, hi everyone. Welcome to CASE Summer Session 2. For those of us who were not with us before, CASE is Californians Advancing Civic Education. We are a nonprofit dedicated to helping all schools in California succeed in the We the People competition and program. This is Summer Session 2. So if you missed Summer Session 1, it is currently on our YouTube channel. You can just search Californians Advancing Civic Education on YouTube. I'll also be circulating a link shortly. I think I already sent it to your teachers, but I'll also send it to folks who registered for this session as well, so that everyone has the information. Before we get started, I'm going to go ahead and have everyone introduce themselves on the call. So if you are a volunteer. So I'll go first. For those who weren't on the last session, my name is Sabrina McGraw. I am president of CASE. I am an alum of the program from 2013. I was in Unit 5, which focuses on the Bill of Rights. And I am currently an attorney in San Francisco for the firm Covington and Burling doing insurance recovery litigation. Nathan, introduce yourself.
Sure thing. Hi, everybody. My name is Nathan T. Stone Lev. I am uh, also affiliated with CASE, as you can see by my username. I was an alum of the program from Irvington High School in 2016, Unit 1, which deals with philosophies and foundational thought for the founders and framers. Um, and I am currently in Washington, D.C., working as an associate construction project manager for the Washington Metro.
Ernest.
Oh, we're going in alphabetical. I am Ernest Zhang. I'm a recent alum of the program, class of 25, Foothills Unit 5, which, as Sabrina mentioned, studies the Bill of Rights.
Katie.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. My name is Katie. I am an alum of the program from 2016. I was in Unit 6, and I often judge Unit 6 and Unit 1 in competition. And I am a park ranger. I teach about ecology and history here in the San Francisco Bay Area at Golden Gate National Recreation Area. Um, nice to meet you all.
Sean.
Good morning. My name is Sean Gentry. I'm also an alum of the program. I was Unit 1 back in 2001, 2002. Still a very big fan of Unit 1, and you'll find me judging that in some of the competitions most likely. I'm also an attorney currently, and I practice employment law.
Ria.
Good morning. My name is Ria. I'm an alum of the program from 2015. I was part of Unit 2 back in the day. We did things with the founding fathers and the learning about the founding documents. I work with CASE as a treasurer, and now I'm a biomedical engineer at a small startup. Looking forward to getting to know all of you over the course of the year. Yeah.
Agya.
Hi, I don't know if I can hear me, but I'm Bhagya. And I'm live from last year. I was in Foothill High School's Unit 3. Yeah, thank you for you guys today.
Great. McKenna.
Hi, I'm McKenna. I'm an alum from last year at Foothill. I was Unit 4, which is federalism and the branches of government and things like that. So, very excited.
Okay, great. And did I miss any case, folks? I don't think so. Okay, great. So we're going to go ahead and get started. So as I mentioned, we had summer session 1 a couple weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, and the focus of summer session 1 was primarily on the branches of government, and that was kind of speaking towards Unit 2 and Unit 4 powers. So it's the branches of government and also founding fathers. This summer session is going to be focusing on topics that are covered or subsumed in Units 1 and Unit 6. So, Units 1 is a lot about the philosophical underpinnings of the Constitution and the founding era, as well as Unit 6, which is more about citizenship and other topics related to that. So, that's what the focus of this summer session is. And to kick us off with that topic for Unit 1 in particular, I'm going to turn it over to Sean, who's going to talk about classical republicanism and natural rights philosophies, which are critical to Unit 1 and all the units, frankly, as basics understanding. So, Sean, do you want me to do the slides for you?
Yes, please.
Great.
And then Sabrina, I also proposed maybe we break up natural rights a little later in the day.
Okay.
Sent you a message on Discord.
Okay. Well, we can start with classical rights.
Let's do it.
Classical republicanism. Sorry. All right. Okay. So you start in here. Is that right?
If you could start all the way at the top.
Oh, okay. Great. Can everyone see that?
I can see it.
Great.
All right, welcome everybody to what is my favorite unit, Unit 1. And we're talking about what are the philosophical and historical foundations of the American political system. This is often sort of subdivided into ideas of classical republicanism, ancient Greek and Roman philosophical ideas, versus natural rights philosophy, which is more of an Enlightenment era, 1600s, 1700s type of philosophy. There are similarities, but there are differences. We often talk about this as a Unit 1 concept, but really it's important for everyone to be aware of these ideas and these topics because it is really universal. And they are concepts that will be important to all the units, whether it's about the presidency, whether it's about checks and balances, case law, the Supreme Court, or with Unit 6, we're talking about sort of the modern concepts of public good and civic virtue. And those topics will come up a lot. And the modern topic will come up in almost every unit. How do we apply civic virtue? How do we promote the common good? And are we still focused on those things as a modern republic and not just at the era of the founding? And so when the framers were looking at this kind of concept, this idea of classical republicanism and how it should form our system of government, they had some things that they could look back on that influenced their thinking about what the best form of government might be for us in the late 1700s. So that included sort of the British foundation of government, which at that time was a monarchy, but it was sort of a constitutional monarchy going back to the Magna Carta. And they certainly looked at Parliament as sort of a loose guide, but they were able to experiment in our colonies with the colonial charters, with later state or colonial constitutions, and those things helped sort of influence what sort of republic or system of government the framers were used to and thought were working well. It's also influenced by the Judeo-Christian tradition. And things like even feudalism, the Renaissance era, the Enlightenment era, all of these things factored into both natural rights and the idea of what classical republicanism should be in I'll say modern, but I mean a late 1700 modern society, and the history of our forms of government in the West that led to and played a significant role in the founders' decisions. Okay, let's jump to the next slide, Sabrina. So in general, the founders were very well read, and we know this because they wrote to each other a lot, and obviously it was harder to write back then with pen and paper. But Jefferson and Adams wrote to each other a lot. John Adams and Abigail Adams wrote to each other a lot. Hamilton wrote all of the time, which of course we know because of the musical Hamilton that he was a very prolific writer, and he focused in particular on sort of this idea of a mixed form of government and a strong federal government, which is maybe a little different to the sort of classical ideas of Jefferson and Adams and some of the other framers of our Constitution, or even Madison. But they had great libraries. And so we know that they were influenced by these philosophers because of what they had in their libraries, what they wrote about to each other. And even Thomas Jefferson's library went on to sort of become the foundation of the Library of Congress in what is now Washington, D.C. So they were reading all of these philosophers and coming to ideas about what was a good form of government. And essentially, they were telling us what influenced them in framing our Constitution. So classical republicanism and natural rights are sometimes considered semi-opposed, but they generally all work toward the common good. versus the self-interest. So why don't we jump to the next slide? Both traditions emphasize things like human nature, what is the purpose of politics or the purpose of our government, and they focused on things that were both good and bad government. So we look at the ideas of tyranny, or classical tyranny um, in Greek and Roman society. We looked at things like fundamental rights and how the government might protect or not protect those kinds of rights under the natural rights philosophy. And so in both systems, we're looking at how they further society and how they further the good of our community and not just the good of the individual or each individual. So it's not about self-interest or what we sometimes think of as a modern idea of rights or free speech. And we're really looking at how both traditions emphasize the good of the whole, the good of the community and the good of each other. Let's jump to the next slide. So you see these ideas sort of outlined in opposition, but they're not always opposed. And so with natural rights philosophy, we're also looking at this concept of a contract with our government. And so how are the fundamental rights going to be protected through our form of government and through the sort of the societal contract we enter into with our government that's going to provide for all of us and not for the government or for the leaders who are in charge of the government. And on the classical Republican side, we're looking at how can we support society? How can we support the security and happiness of all of the citizens of society, and in some cases, non-citizens in our society? Um, and we're looking at this idea in classical republicanism of something called civic humanism, which in some ways is maybe a better description of what we're talking about, but it's civic meaning for the good of the whole, and humanism meaning the rights and interests of all of the humans who are part of our society and part of our government. This was, of course, based in antiquity, which is why we call it classical, so meaning Greek and Roman. But it is really more of a modern, and I say modern meaning like 1700s onward, or a Renaissance revival of those ideas that came out of ancient Greek city-states or the Roman Republic prior to empire. And it's important that human nature be virtuous, that we support the community and we have a high morality. We'll talk about what morality means in a few minutes. Um, Natural rights philosophy had a twist on that where we looked at this idea of the state of nature. So if you've ever heard of Thomas Hobbes, he talked about this idea of the state of nature and what it looked like before there was a government and put in place to protect the common good, and the sort of societal contract with the government, and what the purpose is of those governments and the politic. So the founders were looking at what works and what doesn't work, and they're looking at this from a lens in the late 1700s and what would be best for us based both on these two philosophies and their experience with the colonial era. The classical Republican ideas, as you see there on the slide, start with the idea of the polis. The polis is the state, or that's what it means, and it means the system of our ruling group. So in this case, we're talking about republicanism, but it could be something else. It's essentially the system for ruling the people in that geographic area. The politeia is the how, essentially. It's the constitution. I use that with a lowercase c, sort of the loose idea of the constitution of the government, meaning the organization or arrangement of the state by the people and then by the leaders once they're put in power for the good of the people. And we're looking at Greek and Roman city-states for a guide in that direction. Civic virtue is probably the most important concept of this classical Republican idea, and it means for the public good or the public good. And it's doing things for the benefit of the public and not doing things for the benefit of yourself or your own self-interest. Citizens in a republic are expected to engage in civic virtue. And so if you are a member of society, we expect you to go out and vote, go out and volunteer, go out and do things for the good of society and not just, take or do things for your own self. And so citizenship, if you're a citizen of a republic, talks about this concept of a public life. And it's not just about your rights or having the right to citizenship, but it's also about what you do as a citizen and that you're prepared to do things in public for a community benefit. And so, especially in the Greek era, that was very important if you were a citizen, and that you were furthering society and not just living your own life independently from everyone else. It is, I guess, important to remember that not everyone is a citizen in some of these historical frameworks. And that was the same in the founding era. In both eras, there was a concept of slavery, somewhat different in each era, insidious in nature in both, but slaves, of course, would not be considered citizens. They didn't have the same rights as citizens. And not every person who was a free person had the same level of rights either, even in the founding era. And so, generally, when we're looking at Western tradition, um, until much more modern times, we're looking at white landholding males or men essentially as being the individuals who have citizenship and sort of have these expectations on them to further society. That was certainly the case in the late 1700s for the most part. In our society, in American society, the landholding concept became less important, but we didn't really see universal suffrage or equality until much later in time, 20th century really, before things became more universal. But the framers put us on the track with these concepts. We're also talking in classical republicanism about homogeneous societies. And so, what does that mean? That means groups of people who are like-minded, typically in small communities. So, and that was somewhat true even in the colonial experience, where the people who settled in different regions tended to be like-minded, relatively small communities still at that time, and not the diverse populations like we have in the United States today. And so the framers certainly felt this was more akin to a Greek city-state or sort of portions of the Roman Republic prior to empire, and how the groups of people who were deciding how to form a government were like-minded, they were homogenous, and they were able to sort of strive in similar directions without as much opposition as if they had been more diverse. So this was certainly important to the founders. And then we also talk about this idea of functional social hierarchy. Some of that is de facto, but some of that is decided upon. So meaning who is in charge. So we had kings at different points in time. You might have an aristocracy that's sort of in charge or forming the system of government. And even in the colonial period, the kinds of legislative bodies that were formed tended to be of aristocratic men, often landholding men who formed the legislative bodies in those states or colonial governments. And so there's definitely a dichotomy between rich and poor. The rich tend to be the deciders, and the ones forming these hierarchies. Um, with natural rights philosophy, we're talking about what it means to be a natural person, the state of nature, among other things. And really, the classical Republican, I'm sorry, the natural rights philosophers are focused on this idea of fundamental rights. And so, what does it mean to have rights that transcend the form of government, that transcend what's going on in how you're being ruled, and should be protected by the government? And they're also focused on this idea of sovereignty, which means um, the ability to decide for yourself who should be in charge of ruling you and the people around you in the society. Um, so why did the framers choose these things? It's because of what they looked back on and saw both in the English common law and this idea of mixed government that we saw in England and in the colonial period. And they had a chance to sort of test these theories with colonies and state charters before sort of falling into the Articles of Confederation and then eventually founding our constitutional form of government. So they had things like the House of Burgesses in the Jamestown colony that became Virginia. And that was certainly one of the bodies that the framers looked at as a sort of test case of what was working when we're looking at a Republican form of government. They tended to be single legislative bodies at that time. Even the sort of colonial Congress that was in charge during the rebellion, the American Revolutionary War, and then in the Articles of Confederation tended to be one form of a legislative body, as opposed to this sort of bicameral legislature we came up with, or I say we, but the framers came up with, that is still in effect today. And then the framers also took all these ideas and sort of put a modern twist on it. They looked at philosophers like Machiavelli and Montesquieu. I'm sorry, Montesquieu comes later, but they looked at Machiavelli and other people who would analyze this stuff, like Cicero, and what a more modern version of a Republican form of government could look like. James Madison and John Adams, in particular, looked at the Roman Republic as opposed to the Greek Republic. I mean, they looked at both, but they looked at Rome because it lasted for 500 years before it became an empire. It was very stable. And they felt this is the best form of government that we can see from the history in the West. And so we want it for us, essentially. Hamilton took a little bit of a different approach. And Hamilton was very influential in the writing of the Constitution. He was much more elitist, if you want to use that word. He was looking at sort of an energetic, elitist reformation of this idea of republicanism. And he placed significant trust on the ability of sort of like a better sort of citizen, meaning like a well-educated, well-read, uh, typically property owner citizen to direct their ambitions towards the public good. All right, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so who was influencing all of those founders and framers that I just talked about? And we start really with Plato. Plato had this concept of enlightened leaders, and that enlightened leaders would carry out the common good and have a high level of civic virtue in establishing a form of government and leading all the people to a way that was hopefully beneficial to society and successful. He had this concept called res publica, which essentially translates to the public thing or the things of the people. And that sort of the government is a thing of the people that is hopefully furthering the interests of society and not just allowing the powerful to trample on all of us or grind us under their heel and benefit from us as opposed to providing a benefit to us. Plato wrote the Republic, which may be self-evident, but he wrote a piece called The Republic that talked about the benefits of that form of government, in particular civic virtue. And he focused on this idea of the nature of philosophers or philosopher kings and how the ideal leaders would be in this sort of philosopher king concept, meaning that they were enlightened, they were educated, they were acting in the common interest. And he sort of looked at Socrates as the model for what a good philosopher king would be, and a person who should be the ruler of society, and not somebody who's out to have a tyrannical rule or engage in their self-interest. So he looked at the concept of what it was like to be a just ruler and not using power for themselves. And this formed the concept of what a republic should be that our framers were already looking at and forming, what they hoped the leadership would be of a republic in the United States or became the United States. He also looked at this idea of morality, and morality in Plato or Greek society means education, and it often, sometimes is translated to more of like a religious education, but it's not synonymous with religion. And so our framers and our founders were often religious people and looked at morality and education going in conjunction with religion. But as you know, it was very important that the colonies in the States had freedom of religion so that religion wasn't influencing the government too strongly. But all of this wrapped into a concept of morality and doing things for the public good. And it required education in order to understand what you as a ruler or what you as a citizen needed to do to further the common interests of society. This is a very important concept throughout We the People. It was important to the Greeks, the Romans, it was important to our framers, and I'm quite certain all of you will talk about education and the importance of education in many of your presentations and how the purpose of it is to instill virtue or civic virtue in preparation for citizenship of your nation or your country or your city state or whatever it happens to be. It's important that the society is educated in order to function properly and elect leaders who will represent the best interests of society and not just the interests of themselves. So all that is in this concept of virtue. It's important for the society, for the governing structure to protect the state. We sometimes call that the common good. So what should the government be doing to protect the common good of society? This leads to stability in society, which can allow growth economically and also in education, and also provides for a strong defense. That's a very important concept when we're talking about the common good. Sometimes we think about that as the Army or the Navy, which were formed sort of around the same time as the Declaration of Independence. But a strong defense is an important concept both in Greek city-states, obviously in Rome, and in modern society as well. And some of this is influenced later by philosophers like John Stuart Mill, this idea of utilitarianism, where we're looking to further the greatest amount of good for society, not just for each individual, but the overall good. And sometimes that might mean that things are bad for certain individuals, but ultimately the net benefit is better for society. Essentially putting aside individual wants and desires. An English philosopher, Jeremy Bentham, took this a little bit further and talked about what would be important for this concept of utilitarianism. And then that takes us to Aristotle. So Aristotle then built upon these concepts and argued that there were six general ways in which societies could be organized under political rule, and it depends on who the rulers are and whom they ruled. And so we're looking at sort of three concepts. We're looking at the one, the few, and the many. And then within those groups, we're looking at how they're furthering the common interest versus the interest of the rulers. And so let's break that down. So in the concept of the one, that means there's typically one ruler. And if they're hopefully furthering the common interest, that might look like a monarchy. If they're furthering their own interest instead, that might look like a tyranny, or that's the word that our founders would use, a tyranny. When we're looking at the few, rulers being ruled by the few, we might call that an aristocracy if it's the rich ruling us, but hopefully in the common interest of society. We might use the term, or Aristotle certainly used the term oligarchy when we're talking about a group of people ruling society for their own interests. And then when we talk about the many, we talk about polity being the term used for a group of the many furthering the common interest versus democracy, which is a group of the many furthering their own interest. And now, I don't want you to get confused with the common definition of democracy, but at that time, Aristotle was using democracy essentially to mean a mob rule, or the poor people, if you will, rising up and ruling society without sort of regard for the greater interests of the society as a whole. And typically, the concern, and this is certainly a concern of our framers, was that if that happened, they would oppress the rich, and there'd be a transfer of wealth. They would oppress the rich for their own self-interest, whereas polity, as Aristotle used that term, is a collective organization for societal good to further the interests of society. So that's really what we're aiming for, is this idea of a polity. Um, Polybius, another Greek philosopher, also talked about how a mixed government or a mixed polity would be a good thing. So essentially combining all three types of groups, the one, the few, and the many. And that's kind of what we ended up with a little bit, with the idea of a republic and a legislative formed of a few individuals, like an aristocracy might be, the executive branch really being the one, and then all of the rest of society being the polity, hopefully furthering an interest of society, electing enlightened leaders, and all that kind of stuff. So there's a deep desire here for noble acts in furtherance of the state, both political acts, military acts, and the acts of moral institutions. And then that was influenced further on our founders by the concept of Montesquieu and sort of looking at these types of societies. And he wrote The Spirit of the Laws in 1748. And so our framers were looking at sort of how he analyzed these groups of Aristotelian ideas of who is ruling us and how that provides for a stable society. Aristotle went further to talk about the three functions of government, which are essentially make the law, enforce the law, and interpret the law. And what does that kind of sound like? The legislative, the executive, and the judiciary. So those are the three branches we ended up with, very much derived from this idea of the three functions of government under Aristotle philosophy. And then the next philosopher that our framers were influenced significantly by is Cicero. And Cicero, or sometimes pronounced Cicero, is a Roman philosopher, and he's looking at what an ideal state would look like. And he had a particular influence on John Adams and Madison to some extent. John Adams really looked at Cicero's ideas from the late Roman Republic, because Cicero was writing at a time when the Republic converted to an empire and talked about why that was bad and why republicanism was good or was the best form of government. And he talked about this, in addition to the concept of stability, the idea of enlightened absolutism and providing civic good and civic virtue, which he felt the empire would no longer be doing. And so Adams looked at those concepts of republic and wanted them for us and wanted to avoid the idea of tyranny under the Aristotle idea of tyranny and the influence of one sort of dictator, if you will, ruling society. And certainly King George played a role in this idea as well out in England during the American Revolution and what it might look like to have a sort of dictator in charge. Finally, we're looking at St. Thomas Aquinas, who was a philosopher later in time that talked about virtue and the importance of acting virtuously. He was influenced by Aristotle as well, and he defined sort of the Aristotle ideas in a way that our founders could understand. So he talked about four cardinal virtues. So the four cardinal virtues under this Aristotle concept of government is prudence, temperance, justice, and fortitude. And so those cardinal virtues are natural virtues, and they're revealed in the nature of human beings and need to be binding on everyone. So we all need to show prudence, temperance, justice, and fortitude. Um, he distinguished that with sort of theological virtues. So those four that I mentioned are more what I'll call secular virtues or societal citizenship virtues, as opposed to faith, hope, and charity, which are religious virtues, although the framers and certainly Thomas Aquinas felt that those were important virtues for our leaders to have as well, to have faith, to provide hope, and to be charitable. These virtues are imperfect. They're not, necessarily, or sometimes called incomplete virtues as opposed to perfect virtues. A perfect virtue is any virtue with charity, and the sort of charity makes it a cardinal virtue. So if you're doing these things, if you're having justice, if you're engaging in prudence, but you're doing it for a charitable purpose, that's more what he'd consider a perfect virtue. So that's what he's really aiming for. Um, but he notes that a non-Christian can still display these kinds of virtues. So it's not specifically religious. They can display courage, and they can display courage through or with temperance, as opposed to courage with charity, which was more of in his mind, a Christian virtue. So this is a little confusing, but that's the idea of what Thomas Aquinas felt was a virtuous society and what our leaders should embody. He'll talk about how natural law is based on, quote, first principles, which is essentially so the first principle is the first precept of law, that good is to be done and promoted, and evil is to be avoided. All other precepts of natural law are based on this concept. And so at this point, we're already thinking about this idea of fundamental rights a little bit and starting to bleed into natural rights philosophy, and that we really want to have the idea of good and virtuous and not evil and selfish. Let's go to the next slide. In general, classical publicanism understands that human beings by nature are polis animals. We want to form society. So we have unique capabilities. We have certain talents and communication, the ability to communicate with each other that establish a community and want to make communities that are strong and can promote happy and virtuous societies, as opposed to societies that are just taking and furthering the interests of the strong against the weak. And so humans should form together to make societies that actually protect the weak individuals of society and can further the common good. And this requires civic virtue, as we've discussed already. these concepts in natural republicanism, classical republicanism also require that humans have sort of a unique excellence, that they want to strive beyond their own selfish ideas and their own uh, goals to take for themselves to the detriment of others, and that they're essentially protecting their neighbors. And this requires rhetoric. It requires the ability of leaders and the people trying to form our society to be able to reason, to have education and morality, as we discussed, and to speak well in order to explain their concepts, explain the laws that they want to pass, and how they can benefit society. So this requires education, as we've discussed. It requires order, discipline, and a public spiritedness so that the ideas can be transferred to the polis and then support can be provided for the government so we don't have rebellions and such all the time. Let's go to the next slide. So the purpose of our government is to help humans achieve excellence and happiness. We talked about this idea of small homogeneous communities, and that was certainly still important at the time of the founding. But there's these small self-contained communities that can establish a form of government that help protect everyone in that society and promote civic virtue. We've talked about enlightened self-interest, and the purpose of politics is to maintain a strong defense. I don't want to repeat myself, so let's go ahead and move to the next slide. Okay, so all of these philosophers and our framers talked about what a good government is and what a bad government is. And you can see here on the slide, we're talking about the good form of government in their minds is a small, self-contained community that is a proper balance between the members of community and the rulers. It's primarily focused on education. The rulers and even the polis are wise, that the rulers have a very deliberative rule, so they're making decisions based on an educated understanding of events and what would be beneficial and not just acting on whims or, reacting to a single event. They're allowed, and that's, part of why we have a legislative body that is a little bit slow in the United States because it needs to be deliberative. It should factor in all of the things and not just overreact to something that happened in the moment. And so we want wise, deliberative rulers, but we want both the citizens and the rulers to be civically virtuous. And we emphasize strong defense throughout these slides because that was something that is very heavily influenced by classical republicanism. And we certainly see the United States, we have a very strong, very well-funded military. And so the idea of classical republicanism does focus a lot on the strength of the state and sometimes expanding outward. We're looking at maybe Sparta as an example, but expanding outward and having the ability to ensure that outside influencers aren't coming in and destroying our hopefully perfect form of government. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so let's compare that to a bad form of government. In a bad form of government, and this is especially true in the Greek philosophy, passions are uncontrolled. And if you look at the ideas of Cicero, he's talking about the empire being founded because the passions of the leaders in that era were uncontrolled. They wanted to rule for a tyrannical reason, to have the ability to trample on members of society or other leaders and benefit themselves over benefiting society. This can also happen, though, when we're talking about a government formed by the many. And so if you look, and this is actually after our framing era, but if you look at sort of the French Revolution that came in the late 1700s, you see examples of passions being uncontrolled, and they formed a republican form of government, but it was a malicious form of government where the passions were dictating what was happening, and each set of rulers that came along allowed their own passions to control the government and often punish the people that came before them, leading up to another empire, essentially, which our framers, certainly would not have wanted. There was a preoccupation in a bad form of government with material goods, with gathering things for your own self-interest, with pleasure. And then again, we're looking
Oh,
at
okay.
the Roman Empire and how sort of the emperors were focused on their own gathering of goods and pleasures to the detriment of society, which is the opposite of what we want with a republic. A lot of those types of leaders or tyrannical leaders have very poor civic and personal virtue. They're very selfish. They don't have this idea of charity that Thomas Aquinas talked about, and they're really just self-interest rulers. So that's the bad form of government. Next slide. And when we're looking at state governments, they often adopted these concepts. So we had uniformity, both religious, racial, and ethnic. We've talked about a bit. There was also rigorous citizenship requirements that's relaxed a bit in our current society. Generally, they required residency, which we do still require some today, that you live in the place that you're a citizen of. They required property ownership in many cases, which we don't require modernly. At that time, leading up until the early 20th century, gender or sex was a requirement of citizenship, so only men could vote, essentially. And race played a huge role, of course, in American society, um, really even into the mid to late 20th century, and maybe even modernly, if we're looking at how race affects modern citizenship. And maybe that's a good lesson for Unit 6 to look at with the way our current government is acting towards certain racial groups and how citizenship or birthright citizenship might come into play in being a member of society. We've talked about small communities and civic virtues, so let's move on to the next slide. So, which principles of classical republicanism would you expect to find in America's founding documents? This is somewhat rhetorical, but if you look at Article 1 in particular of the Constitution, there's a lot of ideas of forming a strong military, gathering taxes for the furtherance of society and the common interest. And then, over time, when we look at some of the amendments to the Constitution, we're looking at um, the tax on income in the early 20th century, and how all of this allows us to further the common good by developing streets and roads and all the things that the legislative branch is allowed to do. And we did discuss this a bit right before the break, how there are ideas of our founding forms of our founding documents and how they were influenced by classical Republican philosophy. And we talked a lot about the federal documents, but don't forget that there are some documents that we consider sort of founding documents that predated that. So we're looking at the Massachusetts Constitution, for example, and the Pennsylvania Constitution on this slide. Certainly have some quotes that espouse classical republicanism ideals. Let's go to the next slide. These are sort of a list of the types of documents in early American society that helped frame our government and form this idea of classical republicanism. We've talked about a lot of these already. Let's go to the next slide. Here are some specific examples within those documents that talk about classical Republican philosophy. We mentioned the preamble earlier and the forms of bad government shown by England and King George. The Senate is a really interesting example of republicanism, specifically republicanism as opposed to democracy more generally. We've talked about eligibility requirements and the plenary legislative powers that were left to states. We haven't talked about so much, but we did have this concept of federalism that permeates the government even today, and how a lot of legislative powers and areas of the law are still left to state governments and not the federal government. So this is another idea of a mixed form of government that we talked about under Greek philosophy. Let's go to the next slide. So this is going to be the first slide we talk about in the next section for natural rights philosophy, but thank you all for bearing with me. Hopefully I didn't bore you too much with my classical Republican uh, description and discussion, but we're going to move on to forms of evidence.
All right, with that, I'm going to hand it off to Ria, and I'm going to share my screen if that's good, right, Ria?
Perfect. Please.
Great.
Okay, great. So today I'm going to talk to you about the different types of evidence that you can use in your testimony and question and answer period during the when you actually get into comp civics or we the people questions later in a couple months. So there are 7 different categories of evidence that you'll be able to use in testimony and question and answer. And basically what you're going to want to do in these first few months of the program is create this kind of little evidence bank, and you're going to continue to create it throughout the entire course of the year of just these little facts that you can pull based on the questions that you're asked, because you're not always going to know the questions ahead of time. In fact, you're not going to know about half of the conversation you're going to have with the judges until the actual competition begins. So you're going to want to have a really broad range of evidence that focuses on your unit, so that way you're ready for whatever kind of questions might come your way. You'll have the evidence to back it up. So the first type of evidence that you could use is with philosophy. So this is a specific reference to a philosopher's text, influence, or actions in life. This requires knowing the specific, the context of the philosophical idea, and being able to defend that idea in the future. So you can talk about here's where you would cite the you would say, oh, we're talking about natural rights, I want to talk about John Locke. So that's a good start, but you'd want to add more context. That you don't want to just say, oh yeah, natural rights, John Locke's my guy. You'll want to say something about, oh well, he said something like tyranny is the exercise of power beyond right. And that's really useful. But then do you want to add context to it? So any piece of evidence that you bring in, you're going to want to think about, why am I bringing this in? What point am I actually furthering by saying this? So there are certainly times to where yeah, okay, I'm getting ahead of myself. But yeah, so here's where you would want to bring in a specific philosopher. You might say you'll want to say who they are, give a brief description. Either you want to give a quote from what they wrote about, or you want to talk about their general concepts and ideas. And you want to give context. So you don't want to just say there's this guy who said this thing. You want to say, well, why are you saying that evidence, as much as you can. Another type of evidence you can give is historical evidence. So this is a specific historical moment or action that connects to the ideas in your testimony. So these are examples that best justify your argument, as well as offer the greatest threat of being used in a counter argument. So let's say you're talking about the utility of protest. You might bring up the Montgomery bus boycotts. And you can say that, yeah, this was a useful version of protest. People were upset about the lack of integration on buses. Great. But then if you want to take it a step further, you'd say, well, that resulted in the integration of buses, or that's a part of a larger part of the civil rights movement of all of these different things. Based on the conversation that you're having with the judges, you'll decide how you want to use that piece of evidence. There's really, there are multiple things that you can say at any given time, but you have to choose to select the evidence that makes the most sense in the context. And you've all been writing essays for years now in school, so you have some idea of that, and it's going to get you're going to have a better feel for what to bring up when, as you go through the program. Very early in the year, students often struggle with oh, well, now I've worked myself into a corner where we've talked about the 3/5 compromise. How do I not say that slavery is a good thing? And how do I talk about this in the academic way that we're trying to talk about it without justifying it? Because the founding fathers might have had a reason for it, but then now I've trapped myself in our question and answer period with the judges by saying that they had a reason for it. Now I'm asked about it. So you have to think about how you bring the evidence to light. Another type of evidence, laws, action, and policy, a specific piece of legislation, a set of policies, or direct action taken by the US federal government or another sovereign power that relates to your questions. It can also include the actions of state and local governments. So here, you can cite documents like the Constitution. You can cite the Articles of Confederation. You can cite case law since then, and most of you will cite case law from that point to modern day. You can also cite the Magna Carta from England. You can cite really this is if you're directly citing any types of documents or policy actions taken by the US or another country at some point in history. It's got to make sense with what you're talking about, but that's what this type of evidence is. So here's another place where you'd want to think about the specificity of your evidence, which gives the judges quick context to understand that you know what you're talking about. So if I just say that the Constitution talks about the requirements for to be present, that's great. But if I say Article 1, Section 2, Clause 5, then that tells me that tells me as a judge that you understand where in the Constitution it sits. Does it because should it sit with the executive branch or the legislative or judicial? Because the Constitution is split into those sections. So whatever evidence you could context to your evidence you can add quickly is really useful to help us understand that you understand where you're pulling the evidence from and it gives us quick context. There are obviously other ways to do it. You can use more words and you can explain, but there are quick ways to add context if you're able to cite specifically this piece of policy came from this document around this time period in history or something like that. That's really useful. The next type of evidence is current events, an event within the past year that connects to the issue that you are researching. So you can use your own local events before that. It's a good idea to use those before you use local events from other people. The current event that's off on the top of my head though is not local, but it's semi-local to California. It's the response that the LA mayor Karen Bass had to the sending of the National Guard to LA. She basically condemned that action, saying it did not warrant military intervention. That the protests were largely peaceful. So that would be a point that you could bring up in the struggle between federal and state governments, for example. So another point, I think this is another sticking point that students often get to. If a judge asks you about something recent or current, that doesn't always just mean in the last year, but ideally you'd want to talk about something that happened while you've existed in the world. We've had students bring up things from the Clinton administration, for example, and that's current kind of to the span of history, but it's really not current to if we're asking you about something recent that's happened in the government, because the government has really changed in the last several years. So you'll want to think about the time period. If we ask for something historical, yeah, also maybe don't give us something from the early 2000s, give us something from the 1800s, context dependent. Okay, the next type of evidence that you could use is precedent. So a US Supreme Court case that provides evidence for a key idea or has a quote that explains one of your ideas. This is an idea that has stood the test of time and has a legacy. So here, this is a really common type of evidence to cite Supreme Court case law, and you would when you want to cite Supreme Court case law, you want to give us the title of the case, ideally the year, if you can tell us, oh, this happened in the 60s or this happened, that tells us what time period you're pulling from, and then a brief description, like a sentence or so about what the case actually entailed. So we could talk. You could bring up Roe v. Wade, which gave you the constitutional right to an abortion based on the right to privacy in 1973, but that was overturned recently in 2022, and you might be talking about the change over time by bringing up those two examples. But yeah, it obviously all of this depends why you bring up the evidence that you do when you do, but you really, since you have such a short amount of time to talk, you want to think about how quickly can you distill this point down. But if you were just to say Roe v. Wade, the judges will know what you're talking about, but we don't always know that you know what you're talking about without the description of what it is. But you also want to be able to distill it down to a really short summary so that you're not spending a minute and a half explaining one case when that's really not the context of what you're talking about. The next type of evidence that you can use is statistics. This is a current statistic or a trend over time that could act as evidence for your main question or sub-question. So I've been really impressed by some of the evidence that students have pulled out over the course of time. The way these numbers just stick. You really want to think about with statistics, what is the context with which the stats came out, or what statistic are you using to further your point? Because with voting, you could talk about, well, a Pew Research poll says that 63% of Americans voted in the last election. Great, that's useful. But then if you're talking about the gender divide in voting, or if you want to talk about other demographics, you have to think about what statistics do I actually want to pull? Do I want to say like it's 54% of college graduates vote versus only 35 without a college degree, or something like that. What there are different numbers that you can pull based on the context of what you're talking about. And then the last type of evidence that you can use is a personal anecdote or story. Um, so this is a personal experience or a short story from another person that could be used in a reasonable way to back up an argument. This is not some rambling, cool story, tell it again piece of evidence. It is an anecdote that clearly connects to the ideas in your main question or sub-question. So the trap here is that it's often really hard to distill something from your personal life, especially if you're just thinking about it in the question and answer period, to something short. So you really want to this is one that you probably want to talk about with your unit mates as you get to know them. Say that this is something that's really important to me that relates directly to our question, so that you can think about how to distill it down, because it's much harder, I think, to bring these up and distill them down if you haven't already thought about it in some way. Um, One example that we heard students talk about a lot last year was uh, seeing their classmates scared about the status of their family with the increase in ICE raids. They were scared about what was going to happen to their family and was affecting their quality of education. And so students brought up really specific examples that they had seen in their schools, which was a strong piece of evidence to based on what we were talking about at the time. So yeah, basically with any of these types of evidence, they're pretty straightforward as far as the types of evidence you can pull through. Well, what's useful is how quickly can you distill it down to show us that you understand what it is, and also move on to the actual point that you're trying to get to. How can you quickly give more context to your evidence by just adding a little historical nod to, like, what time period are you talking about, or grounded in, like, what's the who are we talking about, who is this guy, why do we care about this guy? Because if you give us one of the big philosophers, we're going to know who you're talking about. But if you give me some random one that the judges have never talked about or heard about, who's like probably big in the field but also we don't know about, you have to tell us that this Pierre Bourdieu is a philosopher, right? Otherwise we don't know who this guy is and why you're citing him. So you want to think about, what do we know, what do you know, and really think about how you bring that evidence to us. So that's, I think I spoke very quickly, but hopefully that rapid fire gave you some ideas of what kind of evidence you could use. Do you guys have any questions before I stop?
Actually, Ria, while y'all are thinking of your questions, I want to add a few things. As you'll see in the Google Drive, where everything else is from summer session 2, one of the items is CACE evidence sources, where we, as CACE, have added some suggested sources for each of these categories. Now, this is certainly not comprehensive by any stretch of the imagination, but it's enough to get you started on certain aspects of each of these categories so you know where to look. As we discussed in summer session 1, evidence is one of the categories on the rubric, but it also plays a role in almost every other aspect of the rubric, particularly when it talks about understanding and also like analysis, discussion. Because anytime you're going to give an answer during the discussion period, you need to support it with evidence and show your understanding of that evidence to really get full credit for the point. So it's really important that you are thoughtful about the evidence you're using. Another thing that has come up now, more recently compared to other years, I would say, is the development of AI being more accessible to everyone. And of course, I defer to your school's policies on the use of AI to the extent they have them. But I also wanted to express a sincere warning about using AI as a part of this program, because AI isn't just a shortcut, but it also is an inaccurate shortcut. Most of the time, and I've personally witnessed this, AI can do something called hallucination, which means that AI can basically make up facts based off of what it has access to the internet. And I could talk about this for a while, but I want you to really be careful of your use of AI if you're using it at all. And to the extent you do use it to find facts, you should always verify what it's saying with a reliable source. And the sources that we've included here are some of the reliable sources to go to it. But please do not rely on whatever AI says, even if it sounds credible. Please always verify it. The judges are going to know that it's wrong, and also it takes away from the program. So please be careful about that, and I would avoid using it if at all possible. Now, I am screen sharing, so I'm not able to see if people have had questions. So I'm going to ask my other folks, has anyone put questions in the chat about this?
Doesn't look like it. I'll add one more thing, which is it's fully okay to take a stance. In fact, it's really interesting for the judges if you do take a stance and use specific evidence for it, but you should know what the counter example is, what the counter argument is. So if the judges push you on it, you can say it. Or so you could very quickly say, well, the other side says this, but this is what we as a unit, or this is what I believe. My unit mates might say something different, and split panels are okay. But you want to know what the counter argument is to any argument that you make so that you're ready to defend why you've taken a stance and not just taken a stance randomly.
Any other case folks want to chime in on some advice on this evidence piece? Feel free to just talk. I can't see you otherwise.
I think just in general, keeping on top of what's happening in the world, which is hard, and we are living in a time where things are happening constantly, and it's a freaking cannon, like a big hose pointed right at you when you're trying to keep up with the news. But it's really important. And that's something to just build into your routine if it's not something you do right now, is finding ways to keep on top of that because I've seen it happen in competition where something happens very shortly before competition that touches on something that comes up in questions is related to a topic that you're being asked about, and you will be asked about it because it's on the judge's mind. So if you're on top of keeping up with the news, that's really, really helpful.
I would like to jump in with an anecdote. Is that okay?
Sure.
Sure.
Okay. So, yeah, that's very right, as Katie said, that if you read current events, or maybe right on the day of competition, for example, you can use that as leverage against the judges. And this is exactly what happened in I think our scrimmage. I think it was in December, but we were asked a question about the ongoing trans rights case in the Supreme Court. I think it's US v. Scrimetti, and it just so happened that one of our unit mates had read up on the case the very day before, so we were very prepared to answer that question. And yeah, I think Katie's very right.
Okay. Thank you. With that, I'm not seeing any questions, so we're gonna head right into tips for We the People Success, and I'm gonna call upon Nathan to give that presentation. Nathan, do you want me to screen share for you?
If you wouldn't mind.
My pleasure. One moment.
All right. We have an insurmountable amount of several tips and tricks for your successful We the People team. 100% guaranteed, except for sources. We do not guarantee those. Um, Number one, uh, hitting off our last topic, consume 3 to 4 sources of news and current events per day. Uh, that can be your websites, blogs, newspapers, radio, podcasts, thoughtful television news programs. Um, Share them with your teammates and unit members. Share them with literally everybody you come across. You know, if nothing else, you get a more informed community out of this. Uh, Number two, outline your testimonies before you write them. This is just general good writing practice. Um, Start with your thesis and a clear answer to each sub-question. Expand that into an outline with your key points and supporting evidence. Then start writing your prose. And just keep repeating that process all the way down. I know when I first started writing my first testimony, my unit, we did not understand at all how to do that, and we focused entirely on one question and one question alone and didn't answer anything else. So make sure you know what you're doing, like answering the questions, and have an idea of what you want to do before you spend hours writing out an entire testimony that, may or may not be on the right focus. Uh, Number three, debate your positions on issues with your teammates before, during, and after you write your testimonies. Don't be afraid to disagree with each other, as was previously said. It can be really good to have some, different points of view on your panel so that the judges really understand that uh, what's going on with the question. Don't be afraid to rewrite your testimony after you've had time to think about it. If you come to competition with the first draft of your testimony, chances are it's not going to be all that good. Um, as always, when you repeat things, you refine them, you make them better. So highly, highly suggest making many drafts and finding out what works and what doesn't. Uh, Tip number four, get feedback on your testimonies and Q&As from as many people as you can. Practice it for your teachers, other units, anyone who's willing to work with you. Give help. Take notes on the feedback that you get. Don't take the feedback personally. Use it to get better. I know a lot of the times it can be really scary hearing from folks, from your teachers, from us at CASE. We may come off very strong and opinionated, but a lot of this feedback is to make your opinions, testimonies, Q&As better. It's not personal attacks, even though, we may seem scary. We really hope all the best for you. So please, if something seems out of line, ask us to refine it, and hopefully we'll be able to, tailor our feedback to better serve you. Um, Number five, ask for help and use your available resources. Your teachers are resources. CASE, we're all resources. Alumni are resources. I know you probably all have very like you probably have some connections with previous We the People classes, and some relationships with them, and you can use them because they were most recently in your shoes. Ask them for help, even if you're shy. Doesn't matter, because reaching out will help you get better in communicating, which is a major point of what we're doing here with the testimonies and Q&As, being able to communicate your ideas to us, um, or to the judges writ large. Um, Number six, good teams can identify problems. Great teams will identify solutions. It's not enough just to take a position in your testimony or Q&A that something is bad. Like, we all know slavery is bad, or it should be fixed. We all know that slavery should be fixed if we're talking in 1865. But you have to present a reasonable alternative. So saying like slavery is bad and we should replace it with complete abolition. And what would this system look like? That would be an example of a solution that you can identify and build upon in your answers in your testimony, that will really help. Um, Tip number seven, practice arguing the other side of every position that you take. This was sort of mentioned earlier. If you know the counter arguments, it helps inform your own arguments a little bit more. You know where the weaknesses in your argument are, you know where the strengths in the counter arguments are. So seriously weigh those counter arguments on their merits. Try making the argument against a friend or a unit mate, then reevaluate your position to see if you still feel the same way. I changed my position on so many things so many times. Um, and I mean, part of that was because I was Unit 1 and we dealt in philosophy, and that's all you're doing all day is thinking. But really understanding those arguments helps build your breadth of knowledge, your base of knowledge, and that is really what this is all about, right? Um, Tip number 8, work with other units in your class. Have group study practice sessions with as many other units as you can. Work together. I know that for my unit, we had an entire week where we just spent an entire day with another unit teaching them about philosophy. They would teach us about whatever they were like going over at that time. And it was really helpful, especially for the people that, you know, really needed that philosophical evidence in their own testimonies or Q&As. Being able to share that for them and then get knowledge in return. Um, and finally, tip number 9, spend non-we the people related time with your unit. You're going to be spending a lot of time together and it's going to be stressful a lot of the time. So you're going to want to get to know each other and learn to accept each other's quirks and personalities and know how each other tick, just so that you can, problem solve and, be the best unit mates that you can to each other. Because at the end of the day, we're all, trying to be respectful to each other while we're learning how to navigate all of this, right? So yeah, any questions, further comments? We'll let it sit for a second. And any other case folks, if you feel like you can jump in with another tip, feel free.
It's just really important to say as well, and I feel like I say this every summer session. It's also a lot of fun, and you're gonna have fun too. It's work, and it's a lot of research, and it's a lot of learning, and it's a lot of growth, and it will be challenging. I know when I was a student, it was by far the most challenging class I had taken. It was also one of the classes I had the most fun in, and I really built community, and it really, really, really meant a lot to me. And it will mean, different things to different folks, but taking time to build community with your classmates and with your unit mates and to not forget that it's also fun is really important. And I just want to make sure I say that.
And I would add to that that it should, or hopefully will, be very important to you in the rest of your life. So the things that you learn from We the People are above and beyond what you're going to learn in a government class. And this idea that we were talking about with the common good when I was presenting, is important. I think especially right now where we are in American history, all of you understanding your role in society and how you can engage in this civically virtuous way with everything going on around you is important. And it's important for me, it's important for all of us, every member of our society, to try to build the kind of society that benefits everyone, and that we, want to be a part of. So I think We the People will give you the tools to understand that in a way that other courses never would. And I think you'll feel empowered as a result of it. And a lot of people in We the People go on to really interesting careers, not just in the law, but in engineering and all kinds of things.
I would
Park rangers, of course, espousing the common good.
one more thing that I would add is on the like disagreements thing. A lot of the time you guys will disagree, but there's also a lot of things that you guys will all feel the same about. And I think that even when you guys all agree on something, you should still research the other side and even bring it up in hot seat because, for example, if a judge asks you a question and you guys all agree on it, hearing three people say that they all agree on something, like I feel like it gets repetitive at a point. So that last person or that second person could be like, how I agree, however, the other side would argue, blah, blah, blah. So I think that's really important to mention, and it shows that you did your research.
To add on to Harini's point, disagreement doesn't have to be like, I completely disagree with everything Harini said. You can just say, I agree with Harini said, but there's this like slight other aspect that I would like to take into account. You could just add a slight other perspective, and that still helps shift the mood a little bit instead of just talking about the same idea.
One thing I just wanted to emphasize on our tips and tricks is this idea of like meeting with other units. It doesn't have to be that you separately make a separate meeting to go meet with those units and talk through issues, though I certainly encourage that. A lot of what you can learn from other units is just by listening to them present during your class period or during your practices where everyone is going and you're not going. A lot of people tune out or focus on their own research while other units are presenting and practicing. And oftentimes I see that they're not absorbing what those people are saying, and that can be just absolutely critical for making sure that your own knowledge is more well-rounded. So please consider listening to other units, especially what we would consider the sister units, which is typically units 2 and 4, 3 and 5, and 1 and 6, if you're listening to those units. Okay, anything else? Any questions? I haven't seen any questions come through. We're quiet bunch today. Don't worry, we have breakout rooms to make sure that doesn't happen. Okay, so now we're going to move to natural rights presentation. So Sean, I'll cue that up for you.
Great. Thank you, Sabrina.
Can you see it?
I can.
Great.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about classical republicanism, and we touched on the compare and contrasting nature of that with natural rights philosophy in my first part of the presentation. Now we're going to really dive into natural rights philosophy. These are concepts that you're going to be extremely familiar with, even if you're not in Unit 1. These will sort of be important things to talk about, especially in Unit 6 outside of Unit 1, but also some of the other units as well. And it will become, really familiar to you in We the People. But where does this come from? We had this thing called the Enlightenment, or the Enlightenment era that started in sort of the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s. It's a Renaissance concept that sort of started looking at government and the idea of rights, or the rights that we have as human beings, separate and distinct from this idea of, what form of government we have, or who's in charge, or who the king is, or whatever. Um, we can argue about whether these ideas really were enlightened, and part of that is because, who is having these ideas? It's still upper class, typically white men in Western Europe, or Europe in general. So it's still sort of a Western tradition. It's really still men who are writing about this, typically rich men. And so it's not necessarily representative of the ideas of society as a whole, but it's still, I think it really gave our framers a good idea of what the rights are that we shall have as humans. So it is in a lot of ways a counterpoint to classical republicanism, but there are some overlaps we discussed. The counterpoint is that when we're talking about classical republicanism, we're really talking about this idea of collective responsibility, or that the good of society is more important than individual rights. And essentially, our own rights, are subservient to the common good. So that's classical republicanism. Natural rights is kind of taking a step back from that and saying, well, no, shouldn't we care about how happy we are and what our own rights in society are, and how, they're impacted by those ruling over us? So they would say, natural rights philosophers would say, fundamental rights are important. There really were three main philosophers that we look at, and We the People, and especially that the framers were looking at. There are many others, and I think I encourage you to find out who those are in your research, especially if you're in Unit 1, and talk about them. But the three main ones are Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And collectively, natural rights philosophers essentially believed that we as a society are not inherently social or political by nature, and this differs from classical republicanism. So let's jump to the next slide. Right. So we're not inherently political by nature. Um, and so we look at this idea of what it would be in a state of nature. So let's forget about government for a second. Let's forget about rulers for a second. What does society look like when those things don't exist, when it's what Hobbes would call a state of nature? And so I think that's a picture of Hobbes in the upper left there. And In this situation, there is no government. We just stepped out of caves or just formed our first agricultural agrarian society, whatever it is, and everyone's in it for themselves. There's no one out to say who has what rights or, who's more important than another, and therefore we're all inherently equal in a state of nature. There's no executive power, there's no president, there's no king. And so when you're inherently equal and there are no rulers, what do we as human beings or as a collective society need to do to protect ourselves from that state of nature? Because, of course, in a state of nature, anyone can do something to another person without there being repercussions other than what that person may do back to you. So you might have your stuff stolen. Somebody may come into your camp and kill you or beat you up, take your food, take your goods, whatever it is. And this is a problem, obviously. We don't want that. We as a society don't want that situation, and we want to be protected from one another in order for our family or ourselves to be able to survive in a state of nature. And Thomas Hobbes would say, I think he would say, in a state of nature, life is short, brutish, and hard. I think I got that right. Short, brutish, and hard. So it's not a fun place to find yourself. We want to be protected. We want to have happiness, and have our personal matters be protected from society. Classical republicanism would say happiness is a collective thing. We go back to this idea of polity that we mentioned, and everyone working towards the common good. Natural rights philosophers would say, well, it's not so much about that. It's in a state of nature, at least, if you're happy, it's up to you. You have to do what it takes to make yourself and your family happy. And, whatever those things are, even if it affects the common good or other individuals, is up to you. So it's this idea of self-preservation for you and your family. Let's go to the next slide. Yep, so self-preservation, it's up to you. But if we form some sort of politic or some system of government, then those things may be protected better than in a state of nature. So we can try to maintain order in society. Um, and if there's nobody around to declare what order and society should look like, then instead we have chaos. So let's form a system of government. Let's form some sort of society to maintain order and protect each other from ourselves, from each other. To protect also, though, the rights and liberties of each member of society. And so, with natural rights philosophers, we're now for the first time looking at this concept of fundamental rights or fundamental liberty. What are the things that matter to us as individuals and not the collective good of society or the common good? And for natural rights philosophers, there are really sort of three things that are fundamental, and that's a word you're going to want to use throughout We the People: fundamental rights, or the rights that are most paramount. And those three rights are life, liberty, and property. And that's what the natural rights philosophers would say, especially John Locke, who we'll talk about in a moment. That may sound really familiar to you. Thomas Jefferson was significantly impacted by natural rights philosophy, and he wrote the Declaration of Independence. And he, of course, wrote this concept of preserving and protecting the rights to life, liberty, and he used the phrase pursuit of happiness instead of property for his own sort of reasons, but they mean something similar. Finally, the common defense is an important purpose under natural rights philosophers, also an important purpose under classical republicanism, and it's to defend ourselves, and in this case, from invaders, from outsiders to our society. So our society bands together, forms some sort of system of government to protect itself from the Huns or from, some other city state or whatever it is, or in this case, from the British in the United States. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. As with classical Republicans or classical Republican philosophy, we are looking at good and bad government. So for natural rights philosophers, what is a good government? It starts really with this idea of popular sovereignty. It's a really important concept in our system of US government. And that means that we, the people, decide for ourselves who our rulers are going to be. How do we do that? Currently, that's through the voting process typically, or then our elected officials appoint other officials, whatever that looks like. But it's we get to decide who is ruling us. There's different ways that each philosopher looks at who gets to decide and what happens thereafter. but that's generally it. And there's lots of arguments among the different philosophers about what way of deciding it is best. But essentially, all power derives from the people under a natural rights philosophy. We might call that sort of consent of the governed. And then we get into this idea of social contract. That's a term especially that Locke and Rousseau used, but also Hobbes to some degree. And the social contract is the contract that we form with our rulers, with our system of government. And essentially, people must consent to be governed under this idea of a social contract. So that's dramatically different from classical republicanism. We can, of course, talk about what consent means and whether once we consent, we're forever bound. We were not alive in the 1780s to form the US Constitution. We didn't consent, but we still choose to live in the United States. Are we still consenting? Is voting enough? Those are all concepts we can get into in We the People. But essentially, you have a system of government now. The people have consented. What's important at that point is that the government obeys laws, right? It must obey its own laws, and essentially, no one is above the law in a good form of natural rights philosophical government. Um, a phrase we like to use is rule of law, and I encourage you to use that as much as you can. Rule of law essentially just means the law is the thing that governs our society, not the whims of the people in charge. So the executive should not be able to do whatever it wants unless the law passed by the legislative in this case says so. Who gets to decide? The judicial branch about whether the law is being followed or not. Additionally, this means that our government is limited in some way. So we talk about constitutional governments. That means a limited form of government. This is different than a monarchy, or what Aristotle and Cicero would call a tyranny. And so now you have a form of government that may have a monarch, maybe one person is in charge, but it is now limited in some way. So even the English parliamentary system in 1776 sort of fit that mold where you did have a king, arguably had too much power, or at least the framers felt he had too much power, but it's limited by the Magna Carta, by the English Declaration of Right, those kinds of things, and Parliament existing in the first place. And so now, further, the natural rights philosophers are for the first time sort of talking about this idea that is public versus private lives. Excuse me, or the spheres occupied by your own private self versus your public self and what rights the society has. So now you have an idea of things are mine versus things are ours. And that you see play into our form of government with like things like the Fourth Amendment, this idea of having protection of our effects, our papers, our houses, our personhood. And so for Thomas Hobbes, essentially it's important that the government is providing the things that we want. And it's not just governing us for its own sake, but it's creating something that we want. For Hobbes, that typically is just security, security from outsiders, security from harm, preventing others from just killing us at will. Um, and that's what it means to Thomas Hobbes. Um, so he talks a lot about the concept of our sovereign state being protected from other states or other sovereign units. For John Locke, it's a little bit different. He's concerned about protection, but he's also concerned about individual liberty and especially concerned about property. So property is now an important concept, and in order to have a good government, it protects our individual property from others, and especially from others outside our sovereign unit. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so those were all the things that form a good government, but natural rights philosophers also looked at what a bad government is. And so it's sort of the flip, right? If it's not a representative government, we don't have this idea of popular sovereignty, that's a bad form of government. There's probably not a social contract. We are likely being oppressed in that situation. It's bad if it's not responsive, right? It's not acting in our interests as the members of the governed, and therefore it's maybe a tyranny, it's maybe an oligarchy, maybe it's a democracy, and used to go back to this Aristotelian term of a sort of mob rule, but it's not reacting to the things that we need, and therefore it's likely violating our individual rights that we just talked about a moment ago. And it's also not following a rule of law. The law may get passed, people may ignore those laws and just trample on our rights instead. So that's a bad form of government. And when you're sort of listening to this and you're listening to other lectures in We the People or elsewhere and writing your testimonies, you should think about this not just from the views of the framers at the time they were writing our Constitution, but also what's a bad government today? And even if it's a constitutional government, or even if it's the US government, is it following the concepts of good government under both classical republicanism and natural rights philosophy, or is it following some of these concepts of bad government? Is our government abiding by the rule of law? Is it trampling on our rights? Is it representative? And is it responsive to the needs of the people? And all of that is important, and we want you to think about that in your testimonies and in your Q&A responses in We the People. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so moving on from sort of these broad concepts, now we're looking at the individual philosophers and how they articulated these ideas. And so we have this concept of social contract that comes into play with all of these philosophers. You can see this quote here from Thomas Hobbes: "During the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe, they are in that condition called war, and such a war as if of every man against every man." So that's the state of nature to Thomas Hobbes. And you can see the cover down there of his book that he wrote. That's called The Leviathan. It's a good metaphor of Hobbes' idea of a social contract. And so the head there, or the hands and the head, is the king, the monarch, the person governing every member of society. And in Hobbes' idea, that's really the only form of government, this idea of a sort of a monarchy created by the people. But what's important in this picture is the body, the polis, is made up of the people. So in that image, it's all of us in the body of the king. Um, that king is, in Hobbes' mind, an absolute monarch, but he's created from the collective will, the collective free will of the citizens who granted a social contract to the monarch to serve as our sovereign. Um, so we essentially surrender our free will to the monarch, to the king, to the rulers, if we want to broaden the metaphor a bit, in order to create a society to protect all the things we just talked about that are important in natural rights philosophy. We submit essentially to the Leviathan. We create a Leviathan through our decision to form a government. Now, the problem is once that government is formed, how do you rein it in? And so some of the other concepts we discussed, like rule of law, may not apply yet under this Leviathan theory. It's an absolute monarchy. It's still a social contract, but there's no way to really take back the free will once it's given to the sort of divine ruler, the absolute ruler. And so not all natural rights philosophers agreed with that. Let's go to the next slide. We've got some other quotes here from Hobbes. I'll just give you a moment to look at them, but this is the concept we just discussed that's very Hobbesian. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so during this time when you're being governed, so during the time of men, you live without a common power to keep. Oh, we already. Interesting. This slide is duplicate. Let's go to the next one. We'll fix that next time around. All right, so that's the concept of Thomas Hobbes, but John Locke didn't totally agree, and certainly he was aware of what Hobbes was thinking. They're contemporaries in a way, and John Locke wrote something called the Second Treatise on Civil Government. And I would say, I would argue that this may be the most important philosophical work that our founders relied upon in creating our form of government. Obviously, they looked at Cicero and Aristotle and Plato and these classical Republican concepts, but they were really focused, especially some of the founders like Jefferson, even Madison at the framing era, of what was really important to protect the rights of everyone in society, and especially the property holding white men, aristocratic men. And so they looked at John Locke for this sort of concept. And he agrees with some of what Hobbes said, and especially about the concept of us using our free will to form a society. But it's important that our society protect the lives and the property, personal property of the quote, law-abiding citizens, and that we avoid the violation of our fundamental rights through the laws created in society, not just from each other, but also from sort of outside forces. So we call that foreign enemies. Domestic criminals would be the concept of, people stealing our land, stealing our food, stealing our goods, our property. And sort of these things are protected therefore, when we form a society and we give our free will and our contract to those rulers. Um, Locke felt that a king was fine, a monarchy is okay, but it's not the only form of government. But the really big distinction here is that if the king or the sovereign violates our fundamental rights, then there needs to be a mechanism by which we can reclaim our free will, cancel the social contract. And so he would say we have a right or even a duty, an obligation to engage in revolution of whatever form that may take, in order to avoid a long train of abuses. And so I use that phrase specifically because that's the phrase that Jefferson used, or the founders used in the Declaration of Independence, that there had been a long train of abuses perpetuated on the colonists, the colonial governments, by England and Parliament and the King, and therefore they needed to revolt and have a revolution to reclaim the free will that we had granted to our sovereign in order to form a more perfect union, if you will. And so there was an ability to cancel the social contract, and that exists today still in various forms. That we'll talk about more specifically at the end, but things like elections, impeachment, um, amendments to the Constitution. These are all ideas that were sort of built in to allow us to reclaim the social contract in certain ways. Let's go to the next slide. And let's not forget about Jean-Jacques Rousseau. You can see a quote there. And actually, preceding that quote, he talked about the concept of all men being born free, and yet every man is in chain, or everyone is in chains. And so when he's looking at the social contract and the state of nature, he's looking at it under this quote. So every man having been born free and the master of himself, no one else may under any pretext whatsoever subject him without his consent. To assert that the son of a slave is born a slave is to assert that he is not born a man. So for Rousseau, there's a much more egalitarian streak, and consent of the governed is incredibly important. He wrote something called the social contract that was also very influential at that time. So he's more egalitarian than Locke and Hobbes, and he believes in equality, or the act of each individual creating or consenting to our form of government, much more so than sort of this idea of creating government and then being bound by it and maybe being able to revolt, but not necessarily. So he further believed that the state of nature wasn't inherently bad. This is kind of the flip of Hobbes. Because in a state of nature, we are all equal. We all have the same power as each other. And that's a good thing to Hobbes. I'm sorry, to Rousseau. It's a bad thing to Hobbes. So for Rousseau, the only legitimate social contract was a state where everyone remained equal in some fashion. Creating a king or a civil government that lords over others is a bad government. Um, I want to take a moment to remark that all of these philosophers still excluded people in their ideas of everyone, what it meant, or every man even. They're still largely focused on the rich, especially white men in Western society. So women and minority groups, poor individuals who are not necessarily citizens or landholders, are still often being excluded in these ideas of who is granting their free will to create the social contract. So that's important to remember. But under Rousseau's philosophy, pre-civilized humans were not, in fact, warlikes. This differs from Hobbes. And in fact, we need to create a government only because of what comes about later when humans start acquiring property. So a form of government is really a necessary evil, if you will, to protect the property from others. And so property is the problem, but we need a government to protect us and protect our individual rights, especially over those property. Um, Go to the next slide. He talked about these concepts of a civilized society and what it was like prior to civilization. In his mind, the word savage, it appears sort of at the end of this slide. It's kind of a loaded term, but it really means more egalitarian. This idea of savage equality, is more optimal than what he'd call a civilized society. And so for him, a civilized person is not necessarily the peak. It's just an extreme version of a form of society where we're really hyper focused on our rights and our own individual property. And maybe it's better to live in a state of nature. But regardless, you know, that's the reality we have. And so in that case, he talked about forming a social contract just the way as everyone else did in that natural rights philosophy. And let's move on to the next slide. All right, so as with classical republicanism, where would we expect to find these things um, in our system of government and the founding documents? Let's go to the next slide. We've already talked a lot about these three examples: Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and early state constitutions factor in as well. These are some examples where you will find these natural rights philosophies, especially in places where they talk about our rights and the rights that need to be protected. So, the Bill of Rights, for example. Let's go to the next slide. And these are social contracts we've now formed, constitutions that limited government to create a protection of fundamental rights. And in many cases, the Bill of Rights or some form of a Bill of Rights are written first by our founders or our colonial forms of government before they even have a constitution. So in what we're all used to is we have the US Constitution followed by the Bill of Rights that amends the Constitution. Prior to that, that wasn't always the case. Sometimes for our founders and the colonial governors and legislators, the Bill of Rights was the more important thing that was written first and protected us from the abuses of society and each other before we even had some sort of legislative body. This flows out of things like the English Declaration of Right in 1689 that sort of declared the rights of humans or men, if you will, under English rule. And then we see things like the Virginia Declaration of Rights or the Virginia Bill of Rights. And this showed some examples that then established a rule of law that came out of, or advanced us out of the state of nature. Let's go to the next slide. Right, so we mentioned the example of the Virginia Bill of Rights. It's a fairly important one because it influenced our Bill of Rights in the US government. It wasn't the only one, of course, that we had in the states and the colonies. You can see the quote there. I'm not going to read it, but that gives you an example of what kind of rights we're talking about under a natural rights philosophy. Let's go to the next slide. So all of this leads us up to the US Constitution. Some examples we see, we've talked about the preamble to the US Constitution, this concept of we the people, the name of our program. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, essentially are giving our free will to the US government under this three-branch system to have a written form of government, a written constitutional limited government that it protects the rule of law or abides by the rule of law, protects individual rights, has a separation of powers, provides checks and balances. For looking at classical republicanism, also has a mixed form of government, um, but in some ways has a legislative supremacy where the laws flow out of the legislative body, which is important under both philosophies because it is a elected group, right? So it's a Republican form of government, but also through the free will and the elections, the sovereignty of the people who create that group of people to govern us. Therefore, through the election process, we create a social contract, but it also has mechanisms that allow us to undo that social contract to some degree under a sort of a lock theory of checks and balances. Impeachment's kind of the obvious example. Sadly, maybe a historically weak example, but impeachment and removal are ways to sort of change the landscape and get rid of bad rulers or the persons who would create a bad government instead of a good government using the concepts we talked about previously. I think for us as members of society, election is really the primary power here. We get to vote out our House representatives every 2 years or keep them if they're doing a good job. Senators every 6 years, presidents every 4 years. And this allows us to sort of have a mini revolution, if you will, which Jefferson felt, of course, was very important, but the framers did as well. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, I think this might be the last slide, but we're essentially now coming into what does it mean to engage in this program of we the people? And this is the fundamental question that I think this program asks, at least as far as Unit 1 concepts go, which is, did the framers get it right? Did they strike the right balance between classical republicanism and natural rights philosophy? And this is not a clear-cut answer, and you will be answering this question from many different vantage points, from many different periods of history, and you'll be looking at the not just the balance, but how the balance shifts over time. And did the Constitution strike the right balance in 1776? But does it also now strike the right balance between rights and the common good in 2025 and beyond, and everything sort of in between? And so when you're looking at the period where there was slavery, you're gonna have one answer. When you're looking at the period post-Civil War to maybe the Civil Rights Movement or women's suffrage, that's going to be a different answer potentially. And when you're looking at, the late 20th century, that's probably going to be different than what we're looking at in 2025, and how rights are being protected or promoted to the detriment of the common good, or how the common good's being promoted to the detriment of our individual rights. And we're going to want to hear from you, over time about how these things are balanced. James Monroe, you see this quote here. He was the fifth president, and he asks, where he says, Americans have always managed to weigh the celebration of the individual with the responsibility for the community, market striving for civic caring, the private sphere, and the public good. And so I'll leave you with that quote. And I want you to be thinking about these two concepts and whether we have a good form of government or a bad form of government. And if our framers and all of these philosophers would agree that we did a good job here. So thank you for your time, and thank you for letting me present.
Thank you so much, Sean, for that presentation. Reminder, everyone, this is going up on YouTube, so if you ever want to go back to Sean's presentation on this topic, which I really recommend as you go throughout the program, it will be available there. You also have the slides available in the Summer Session 2 folder that I circulated. So I know we're running.
Can I
Yeah.
say one other thing? The YouTube channel is really great because it's not just this year, it's also many years in the past. So I presented some of these topics 5 years ago, but there's been a number of other teachers of We the People programs who presented the same thing over time, plus all the other summer sessions. And so, that's a good channel to go look at. You can see these concepts presented by other We the People members, and not just, me, if you want to learn more.
Yep. Great. Okay. And so I know we're running a little late, but we're going to do the breakout rooms now. And the point of the breakout rooms is we are all going to separate, and taking account sort of the natural rights and classical Republican ideas that we talked about today, we're going to be answering more of a Unit 6 based question, which is, what is the most important duty of citizenship and what is the least important duty of citizenship? So we're going to go into breakout rooms. You're all going to discuss. We're going to be a bit on the shorter side. We're going to do it in 7 minutes, and I'll summon everyone back. And then we will vote and see what is the most important duty and what is the least, according to you all. So give me just a second to get the breakout rooms sorted, and then we can go on from there. And can we have the recording stop or paused, please? All right, folks, as we're heading back in, can everyone please put in the chat any of the rights and responsibilities that we discussed, that you discussed in your or duties of citizenships that you discussed in your groups. I'm going to add them to the poll so that we can all vote. So please put it in the chat. Thank you. For both the least important and the most important.
While people are doing that, I'll say in our room, we just concluded with a sort of question about how do you pick a least important when all of them seem important? So I thought that was a good question, and I will say that to all of you as well. The most important, a lot of good ideas. The least important was maybe a harder analysis. It's a good list showing up in the comments. I'll just
Great.
read some of them out for the record, since the recording can't see the comments. So we've got political participation, civic virtue and staying informed, voting, community service, obeying the law, selective service, civic engagement and serving your country, informed citizenship, voting, obeying the law, being involved, committed, and knowledgeable politically at any level, informed voting, community service, critical thinking, civic education, defense, voting again, political dialogue slash debate, civic virtue and voting, taxes, paying taxes, jury duty, obeying the law, and we're starting to get some repeats. Ooh, empathy, that's a new one. Community volunteering, voting seemed to be the most repeated one.
Okay, everyone, the poll is live. And what I have put in there is political participation slash civic engagement, staying informed, voting, jury duty, community service, obeying the law, selective service and or military service, and taxes. And those are the same choices for both the what is the most important duty of citizenship and what is the least important duty of citizenship. So I'm going to give everyone a chance to vote. We have 60% participation thus far. Oh, climbing up to 80%. Great. For those voting for voting being the most important, got to get everyone in there. We're at 90% now. I'm waiting on 3 people. And we have 100% participation. That's unheard of in the United States of America. Well done, everyone. Now I am ending the poll, and the winner for what is the most important duty of citizenship at 32% is political participation, civic engagement. Wonderful. I think that maybe is the first time that that has won when we've done that vote. So I think that's really encouraging, and you
Yeah.
all are on track because this is a really important part of civic engagement, political
I
participation.
love that the outcome.
Yeah, it's great. And then what the least important duty of citizenship is, according to you all, is military service at 45%. Oh, and I can share the results today I learned. Can you all see that? Awesome. Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining us today. I know we went a bit over time, but we really appreciate your participation and your time, and we look forward to seeing you for the third summer session. I'll be sending out a link to summer session 2 once it's uploaded to YouTube, as well as summer session 1, which is already on YouTube this year. And we look forward to seeing you soon.